At the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, we have a robust voting rights program, as I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with. You're probably familiar with our Election Protection Coalition, which is the largest national nonprofit voter protection effort, and I will once again plug our hotline. For anyone that ever has voting issues, they can call 866-OUR-VOTE. That's OURVOTE. And we always have volunteers ready to help people in all 50 states with any voting problems they encounter. Our Voting Rights Project is doing a lot of litigation. It always does a lot of litigation on voter suppression issues. I'm just going to highlight one briefly, which is in Georgia, which is one of the 5 states that has a completely paperless voting system. We are co-counsel in a case with local organizations and local activists challenging that election system, and recently, a couple months ago, the judge ruled for the first time ever that paperless voting systems are unconstitutional and ordered Georgia to replace its system before 2020. Georgia is in the process of procuring a ballot marking device system, which probably is going to have its own constitutional issues because it's not hand-marked paper ballots. The problem is with ballot marking devices, the voter might be marking a piece of paper, but or rather the machine is, the voter is using a machine that marks a piece of paper, but what's actually being scanned and recorded is a barcode on that piece of paper, not something that the voter themselves can verify is their actual vote. And barcodes can be tampered with. So we are looking forward to seeing how that case progresses. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of the other side of the online voter suppression and election interference issue. We have the cybersecurity issues, and then we also have the sort of propaganda campaigns and election interference issues that we saw sort of for the first time in 2016, again in 2018, and they're only going to get worse. So what do we know? We know from the Senate Intelligence Committee report, from the Mueller report, from the Mueller indictments, that in 2016, the Russian government targeted African American voters in the United States for voter suppression campaigns on social media and other platforms. And what is troubling about this is, by and large, everything they did was just using normal marketing techniques. They didn't necessarily, big asterisk, they didn't necessarily violate the Voting Rights Act. They didn't necessarily do things that, in some instances, were illegal, right? What they did, this was not a failure of the social media companies or social media platforms. They used the system as it was intended to be used. They did an online marketing campaign. They used the same systems that commercial advertising companies and other marketers use to promote a specific agenda, a specific point of view, and to do it in a micro-targeted way where different segments of the population are receiving different messages. So one of the things that I want to sort of convey here is that when we're talking about voting rights, especially online, it is a civil rights issue. It is also a privacy issue. Because one of the things we need to keep in mind and think about is the broader ecosystem in which this is happening. It's happening online in an ecosystem where every single thing you do is being recorded, tracked, and put into a profile of who you are. And if these companies that were doing the tracking did not have 10,000 or 100,000 data points on you that allowed them to profile your personality and your preferences and your demographics, and then allowed advertisers to micro-target you and this person and your neighbor with differential messaging based on those profiles. The type of campaign that the Russians did in 2016 and that others will continue to follow would not be possible, or at least it would not be nearly as effective as it currently is. So with that sort of as a preface, let's unpack a little bit like how this campaign worked, right? So I said before, it didn't necessarily violate the Voting Rights Act, and that's a problem, right? When the Voting Rights Act is a wonderful law, but it only covers certain things, and one of the things it doesn't cover is deceptive messaging, deceptive voter suppression. So the way that these online propaganda campaigns worked is first the Russians, or I'm just going to use the Russians as shorthand, but frankly there's other foreign actors from other countries, and increasingly we're going to see domestic copycats as well. But the way they worked, they started by just building broadly appealing groups of followers online, right? Like you create a group on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever for something really popular where you're sharing just stuff from pop culture and funny memes and funny videos and just stuff to accumulate followers. And you do that for, they did it for several years. Build up a huge base of followers, nothing political, nothing controversial, nothing problematic. Many, if not all of us at one point or another probably saw this content because it was designed to go viral, it was designed to be popular. And then once they have a big base of followers, they start to undermine trust. And they do that by shifting the messaging in a way where, to try to convey the message that you can't trust mainstream news organizations. You can't trust established institutions. You can't trust them. And so, but you can trust me. We won't lie to you. And so, once you start undermining that trust and establish vectors for reputable information, you can then start to undermine truth as well. And so if no one can trust any source of information, then everything is possible. Then all these different stories can come out of wherever and develop a following, develop people who are like, this is, they're lying, this is true, even if it's the most ridiculous thing in the world. And then these platforms started, once they got into that position, they started to push an alternative narrative. You start seeing the conspiracy theories about various candidates, various actors, various political figures. These conspiracy theories are often laden with racist or sexist or anti-Semitic messaging embedded within it. And then the final step, once you get close to the election, is, if you're in this community, don't vote. This is a conspiracy. They're using you. They don't really care about your interests. Don't vote. Or if you're in this community, you have to vote for this person. You have to show up and support. And that's sort of what we saw in 2016. We saw some more of that to a lesser extent in 2018, although to be perfectly honest, it's extremely difficult to track this stuff on the social media platforms just because of lack of transparency. And we very much expect to see it in 2020. What we expect to see in 2020 will be more advanced. There will be stuff that we are not currently anticipating. It will come from probably domestic political organizations. And really, it's even more concerning when it's coming from domestic political organizations, because when the Russians do it, they don't necessarily have the most nuanced understanding of our political environment. They have, it's filtered through intelligence agencies and a couple degrees of removal. When our own domestic political operatives do it, they are the most expert in where our pressure points are. And so that's very concerning. So that's sort of what we see coming down the pipe. one of the things in particular that we're very concerned about, and just sort of to give you an example of the way that new forms of technology are coming into play, we're very concerned about something called deepfakes, right? So what this is I don't know how many of y'all saw a few months ago the sort of fake altered video of Nancy Pelosi that was shared where they like slowed it down to make it look like she was drunk or something, and it was a fake video. They took a regular video, they manipulated the video to make it look like it was something else. That is sort of halfway to what we mean when we talk about a deepfake. A deepfake is a completely fabricated video, usually created by artificial intelligence and other advanced sort of machine learning computer systems. Completely fabricated video of a person speaking, talking, giving a statement. There can also be, fake audio. It doesn't have to just be video. And the idea is that the AI algorithms have gotten to the point where if you have a couple hours or maybe less, maybe more, if you have a few hours of video of someone talking, over the course of those few hours, you will probably get every phoneme that they could speak, right? You're going to get every sound and facial expression that you might need. And then the computer can fill in the gaps, slice it all up into tiny little pieces, and you can then write your own script and recreate a video of that person saying whatever you want them to say. And it will be completely fabricated. And the technology is getting to the point where without sophisticated analysis, you won't be able to tell the difference between a real video and a fake video. That's obviously really problematic for this sort of like post-truth world that we are dealing with in a voter suppression context. Just to give a couple examples, one of the things that that I expect will probably happen before November 2020 is a deepfake video of a political candidate using racial slurs. And it will be like, look at so-and-so, we found this video of them saying these horrible things. And then, ensuing media firestorm about, is this real, is this fake? Or on the flip side, you could have a candidate that actually does say something terrible, and then someone releases a deepfake of them saying something innocuous to question whether the real statement is real. This is something we're going to have to deal with within the next year. That's just the problems with it in the voting context. There's a lot of other issues with deepfakes and other contexts that are sort of beyond the scope here, but I'm happy to talk about that after. To give a few examples of sort of the types of online voter suppression that we saw just in the 2018 midterms, we did a lot of social media monitoring. We partnered with the major social media companies where we had a direct line into their quote-unquote election war rooms, which really just means like we knew someone on the corporate staff that we could call and say, hey, here's a thing, take it down. It violates your rules. Sometimes they take it down, sometimes they don't. But some of the examples of stuff we saw. So on Facebook in Wisconsin, people were sharing fake flyers from ICE saying that ICE will be at the polls checking citizenship, be prepared to prove your citizenship when you show up to vote. That's a classic intimidation tactic. We saw in Georgia a right-wing militia making veiled threats of violence if Stacey Abrams won the gubernatorial race. We saw in Florida election officials in Broward County and Palm Beach County, I believe, both of whom were women of color, were doxxed by a Confederate group, or a man who was a neo-Confederate who shared their information with a Confederate group on Facebook. Doxing means that in this case, he shared their names, their photos of their homes, their addresses, and said and he shared this with. It's not like he's just saying like, oh, here are the people that are running our elections. this was a clear and avowed neo-Confederate sharing this information about election officials who were women of color with a Confederate group on Facebook, while, recounts and other things were underway, in a race where you had a black man running for governor of Florida, and those were two key counties. The voter suppression online goes in multiple directions. So in North Dakota, we saw ads on Facebook that were targeting hunters and saying that if you vote in the North Dakota election and you're a hunter, you could lose your out-of-state hunting license, which I had to go research, and that is not true. You will not lose your out-of-state hunting license if you show up and vote. But it was trying to suppress a certain type of voter who in this case, I believe that ad was run by a local Democratic organization. They're targeting a certain demographic of people. And then finally, actually a couple more, not finally, unfortunately. We also saw a number of racist and anti-Semitic robocalls, all stemming from one neo-Nazi organization, targeting Stacey Abrams, targeting Andrew Gillum, targeting Dianne Feinstein, and others. And then there was President Trump's Migrant Caravan App. And for those that aren't familiar, this was an advertisement that President Trump put on Facebook, Twitter, and other outlets. The ad was banned by a number of TV networks and sort of banned by Facebook. They did not allow it to run as an ad, but they still allowed him to share it as organic, unpaid content. And when you are the President of the United States and you have millions of followers, you don't really need to pay for your content to be seen very widely. This ad, directly compared migrants fleeing oppression in Central America to criminal gang members and drug cartel members and murderers. And it specifically referenced one Mexican drug cartel criminal who killed police officers. And it said, that's who these people are. It was a classic racist dog whistle, not even really a dog whistle, advertisement. And Facebook didn't take it down. And so this is the sort of thing that, there's this push-pull tension with the social media companies where there is voter suppression happening on their platforms. These platforms are the biggest outlets for people to get their message out and also receive information and news. And the platforms are not regulating themselves and ensuring that bad things aren't happening on their platforms. In this case, Facebook told us that the ad did not violate their policies because it was only implicitly racist, not explicitly racist. And at least at that time, their policies did not prohibit implicit racism. That's
Have they changed that?
not exactly. They've been tweaking it, and they keep telling us they're working on it, but it is not completely. It is not fixed. No. And then good luck getting Twitter to do anything. They're even worse. And so one other thing to keep in mind when we're looking at all these issues is that it's not. We have to also remember it's not just the 2020 election we have to deal with next year, it's also the 2020 census, which is incredibly important. And just like how we need people to show up at the polls, we need people to participate in the census. We need to ensure that the census doesn't get hacked. We need to ensure that people trust the data coming out of the census, not just because it's used for redistricting, which is incredibly important, But because for the next 10 years, it's the foundation of like all federal funding distributed to the states. That's going to be an incredible challenge that we have to think about as well. In terms of combating online voter suppression, we sort of have like 3 key takeaways that we're looking for. The first is there needs to be a prohibition on deceptive voter suppression. So this is partially addressed in H.R. 1, but currently the federal law is insufficient for addressing deceptive voter suppression, and that needs to get addressed. And that also means at the corporate level, companies, changing and structuring and writing their own policies, they can go ahead and do this if they want. They can, ban and prohibit whatever they want. The First Amendment doesn't apply to them. So they need to, take action on these implicit racial appeals, and they need to make sure that their rules apply equally for both paid advertising content and just organic content that people share. Next, a huge challenge here is we just don't have enough data about what is happening on the various platforms. We don't, as outside organizations, we don't really have any ability to get the 30,000 foot view of who is seeing what on different platforms. On Twitter, there's slightly more ability just because it's the architecture of the platform itself is more open and you can see everything that's happening, and there's greater ability for researchers to monitor Twitter activity and do in-depth analysis of it. But on Facebook, you only see what Facebook wants you to see. And what I see is different from what you see, is different from what you see. And you can't trust that what you're seeing is an accurate representation of reality. It's your reality that Facebook has curated specially for you. Same for Instagram and other platforms. So we need the platforms to publish data in regular quarterly transparency reports about all the ads that are happening on the platform in a way that discloses, aggregate level, not privacy invading, but aggregate level statistics about who is the ad being targeted at, who is actually seeing the ad, who paid for it, what are sort of the basics here, so that we need this information to figure out where and when disparate impacts occur, right? And then finally, we need the platforms, the companies that are so intertwined with everyday life and how we experience the world. We need them to partner with voter protection and voting rights organizations to help us figure out how to target our extremely limited resources. So, if Instagram sees a ton of people in one jurisdiction all starting to talk about problems at the polls, tell us, tell us that in, such and such county there's problems. Tell us where the hot spots are so that we can alert local officials, so that we can mobilize local voter protection resources. And similarly, Facebook and other platforms have tools to help register people to vote and help them find their polling place. To build those tools, they often partner with local election officials and secretaries of state and things like that. And to do that, they're getting information from local officials about local rules, local policies, local regulations for voter registration and polling hours and all these sorts of things. That's information that is no longer being aggregated at the federal level, but these companies have it, and they could share it. They could say, here is a compendium of all the different local voting rules that we're no longer getting after Shelby County. And sort of help us rebuild that infrastructure to monitor different states and counties and areas, especially the ones that historically have a lot of issues with voting rights. So that's sort of my rambling spiel, but thank you very much.
That
Yeah.
is very slow.